This enclosure was designed to hold roughly 3,800 mice, but the colony began falling apart when the population had reached only about 2,200. The feeders were still full. Water was still flowing. So the classic explanation, they simply ran out of food, does not work here. In 1968, ethologist John Calhoun released 8 white mice into this enclosure, 4 males and 4 females. After a 104-day adjustment period, the population began doubling roughly every 55 days. Growth stopped on day 560. The final conception occurred around day 920. The popular conclusion is simple: comfort killed them. Convenient, dramatic. But the experiment never proved it. So what actually happened inside? John Calhoun did not arrive at Universe 25 by accident, and certainly not because he suddenly thought, what happens if I put a lot of mice in one room?
He was an ethologist, a scientist who studied animal behavior, and he worked within the United States National Institute of Mental Health. For years, Calhoun observed how rat and mouse colonies changed under conditions of high population density. Back in 1962, in a paper titled Population Density and Social Pathology, he used the term behavioral sink. Calhoun used it to describe a persistent breakdown of normal behavior in places where ordinary social contact turned into constant pathological crowding. By the late 1960s, the subject sounded especially alarming. The human population was growing, cities were expanding, and fear of overpopulation had firmly entered politics and popular culture.
Universe 25 was intended to be a more controlled test. Remove shortages of food, water, and protection, then see which problems remained once the usual explanations were gone. The number 25 simply meant this was another enclosure in a long series, not a secret code for the end of the world. Calhoun needed a new, carefully engineered world. Universe 25 occupied roughly the area of a small room, a square measuring about 9 feet by 9 feet. Not exactly an entire universe, despite the name. Multi-level living structures rose along the walls. Vertical wire mesh tunnels led to the nesting areas. Later reconstructions describe 16 of these access routes and 256 nesting boxes. Feeding stations and water dispensers were located below. Supplies were regularly replenished, the temperature was controlled, and there were no predators inside. According to the calculations, the enclosure could physically hold around 3,800 mice. But that number only showed how many bodies could fit inside. It was a little like calculating how many people can be forced into an elevator while completely ignoring comfort, personal distance, and common sense. The estimate said nothing about usable territory, a quiet nesting site, or the ability to avoid unwanted contact. The central feature of the design was simple: the mice could not leave. A mouse could climb to another level, cross the central area, or occupy a different box. But every possible route still ended inside the same square. While there were only 8 animals, that limitation barely mattered. During the first 104 days, the system really did look like a safe and functioning world. On the first day, only the 8 founding mice lived inside. For the next 104 days, they explored the tunnels, feeders, and nesting boxes. No serious breakdown was visible yet. The animals occupied open areas, built nests, and adjusted to the new environment. Basically, this was the brief period before the neighbors became the main problem with the property. Then the first litters were born, and the pace changed dramatically. During the growth phase, the population doubled roughly every 55 days. 8 mice became 16, then dozens, then hundreds. Food and water continued to arrive, but each new generation inherited less open territory and encountered other animals more often, while moving toward a nest or feeding station. By day 315, more than 600 mice were living inside. Officially, the enclosure still had enormous spare capacity. In practice, the space was distributed unevenly. Stable groups controlled the most desirable territories. Other areas were barely used, and the routes between them became increasingly congested. Population growth still looked like a success, but young males were already facing a question the original 8 never had to answer. Where do you establish a territory of your own when all the good locations were claimed by the animals who arrived before you?
Mice are territorial animals. In a stable colony, an adult male controls an area with access to food and nesting sites. A defeated animal can usually retreat or leave the group. In other words, nature normally provides an exit chat button. Universe 25 did not. Young males reached adulthood faster than territories became available. After losing a confrontation, they could retreat toward the center, but beyond the center was still the same enclosure. A population of displaced animals gradually gathered there. Some almost completely stopped defending themselves and sometimes failed to respond even when attacked. Others moved unpredictably and became aggressive without any clear territorial purpose. Some females moved upward toward the nesting areas, apparently trying to reduce the number of unwanted encounters. The problem was no longer simply the number of mice. A defeated animal could not end the conflict, leave for a new territory, and start again.
With each generation, ordinary routes increasingly turned into repeated confrontations. Even reaching a feeder filled with food meant pushing through a dense group of other animals. The food remained. The water remained. Personal space apparently left and never came back. Resource abundance did not remove the pressure because the structure of the enclosure gave the animals no way to separate permanently. Calhoun called this mechanism the behavioral sink, pathological crowding that gradually disrupted normal patterns of behavior. The term existed before Universe 25, and it did not simply mean high population density. The problem began when the most ordinary activities had to pass through the same crowded groups again and again. Even lunch became an event nobody wanted to attend, yet everyone somehow arrived at the same time. Food remained in the trays, but reaching it increasingly involved pushing, interference, and repeated confrontation. The same pattern appeared in the tunnels and around nesting areas. Females had to defend entrances more often, move their young, and search for another location, still inside the same enclosure. Maternal behavior gradually became unstable. Some litters received inadequate care, individual pups were abandoned or lost, and offspring survival dropped sharply in the most disturbed sections. The colony did not collapse in a single day. First, feeding stopped being a calm activity. Then the nest changed from a protected space into an area of repeated intrusion. After that, a new generation grew up with little exposure to stable territorial defense, reliable care for offspring, or predictable relationships among adults. An unusual group appeared among these mice. They rarely fought, did not defend territory, and spent most of their time eating, sleeping, and grooming. It sounds relaxing. In reality, it was anything but. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. The name sounds like an exclusive club, but membership was clearly not good news for the colony. Their fur remained clean and showed almost no signs of fighting because these mice avoided territorial conflict. They did not defend areas, interacted very little with other animals, and showed almost no interest in mating. Most of their time was spent eating, sleeping, and grooming. From the outside, the beautiful ones appeared healthier than many of the mice living below. But for the future of the colony, they were effectively lost. This group took almost no part in reproduction. and this behavior did not appear after the enclosure had emptied. On day 560, the population reached its peak of roughly 2,200 mice, even though the theoretical capacity was much higher. Food and water were still available. The service was working. The colony was not. The number of births continued to decline.
Around day 920, the final conception occurred.
Animals were still alive inside the enclosure, but no new generations were being produced. From that point onward, the population could only age and shrink. Calhoun called this the first death, the death of behavior, which was eventually followed by the physical death of the colony. That dramatic phrase soon produced a conclusion the experiment itself had never directly proven. In 1973, Calhoun published a paper titled Death Squared, a surprisingly energetic title for an academic publication. 3 popular conclusions grew out of it, and all 3 are still frequently repeated as established facts. First, comfort killed the mice. Second, because the enclosure had been designed for 3,800 animals, overcrowding could not have existed when the population was only 2,200. Third, the mouse colony revealed the inevitable future of human cities. 3 conclusions. 1 problem.
The experiment did not directly prove any of them. Calhoun himself described 2 deaths. First came what he interpreted as behavioral death. The animal stopped mating, defending territory, and raising offspring. Physical death followed later. He connected this collapse to a situation in which more animals were trying to occupy stable positions within the group than there were social and territorial positions available. But that was the researcher's interpretation, not a separately measured result. The experiment documented falling birth rates, aggression, disrupted care of offspring, and the eventual extinction of a closed colony. It could not independently prove that comfort, lack of social roles, or any other single factor was the sole cause. Science rarely delivers one perfectly packaged explanation with a decorative bow on top. But the story was too useful to resist. It became a warning against abundance, large cities, social change, and almost any way of life somebody considered suspiciously easy. The mice became a political metaphor before the conditions inside the enclosure had been examined critically enough. To understand what Universe 25 actually demonstrated, we have to return not to its dramatic moral, but to its 4 walls, tunnels, feeders, and complete absence of an exit. The central mistake begins when population density and crowding are treated as the same thing. Density tells us how many animals occupy a given area. Crowding begins when another animal repeatedly blocks your route to food, enters your nesting space, or prevents you from retreating. It is the difference between "there are many people in this room" and "somebody's elbow has officially become part of your face." That is why the theoretical capacity of 3,800 mice tells us very little about the quality of the space in which they actually had to live. In Universe 25, the nesting areas were arranged along the walls, and access depended on a limited number of vertical routes. Food remained in the trays, but approaching it increasingly meant moving through dense groups. A defeated male could not establish a new territory outside the colony. A female could not move her nest beyond the enclosure. Every attempt to create more distance ended in another section of the same square. The location changed. The system did not. This was not simply a large population. It was an environment in which unwanted contact could never be ended permanently. The second problem was the poverty of the environment itself. The mice had food, water, and nesting boxes, but they had almost none of what researchers now call environmental enrichment: new routes, materials to explore, opportunities to dig, build, or choose different activities.
It was a hotel with free meals, no checkout option, and absolutely nothing to do. That is why the popular word paradise is misleading. Material security does not automatically create an environment that supports normal animal behavior. A full feeder cannot replace the ability to explore, choose, and alter your surroundings. The experimental design also makes it impossible to cleanly separate the effects of repeated contact from the effects of confinement, monotony, and changes between generations. The final generations were born after the colony had already started breaking down. They never experienced the empty enclosure and never developed inside a stable community of adults. Their world already consisted of withdrawal, unpredictable aggression, and disrupted care of offspring. A functional mouse society was about as real to them as an empty parking space in the center of a major city. So the behavior of the beautiful ones can be understood not as evidence of some mysterious spiritual death, but as the result of developing inside an environment that had stopped functioning normally. The experiment did demonstrate something important. A closed environment can disrupt behavior even when the feeders remain full. But it did not prove that comfort destroys a society. What it showed instead was how dangerous abundance can become when an animal has no exit, no meaningful choices, and no functional environment in which to act. And before applying that conclusion to human beings, we need to answer another question. How similar is a person to a mouse permanently trapped inside somebody else's design? The largest mistake appears when a mouse enclosure is treated as a miniature model of human society. Mice plus walls do not equal New York City, no matter how badly somebody wants an attention-grabbing thumbnail. Human beings also suffer from crowding, isolation, and a lack of control over their own lives. But a human city does not have to remain a sealed cage. We can move elsewhere, redesign neighborhoods, create new professions, change rules, build communities, and invent new ways of interacting. Even the same population density can produce very different outcomes depending on housing quality, transportation, public spaces, and the ability to spend time alone. Universe 25, therefore, does not predict the inevitable collapse of large cities. It illustrates a much narrower mechanism. Behavior can break down when unwanted interactions are repeated, territory is distributed unevenly, and the environment can neither be escaped nor changed.
Inside the experiment, every generation inherited the same architecture created by the researcher. There were no elections, reforms, or public consultation meetings. Human beings can argue with architecture, change institutions, and construct new spaces. The direct comparison with modern society sounds dramatic, but scientifically it remains weak. A mouse could only adapt to the rules it was given. A person can change the rules themselves, although, judging by some meetings, we occasionally make an impressive effort to conceal that ability. And yet, Calhoun did not believe that the human outcome was predetermined. In his work on space and behavior, he argued that human beings could expand not only their physical environment, but also their conceptual environment by creating ideas, relationships, and new social roles. He called this capacity conceptual generativity.
The term is not especially friendly, but the idea is useful. When old rules stop working, people can invent new ones. In that sense, the lesson of Universe 25 is almost the opposite of its popular moral. The colony was not destroyed because life had become too easy. The experiment combined confinement, monotony, repeated unwanted contact, and the inability to leave an imposed environment. We cannot reduce the collapse to one perfectly established cause. But we can reject an overly convenient slogan. Comfort alone does not destroy a society. Otherwise, the sofa would have to be declared civilization's greatest enemy. A more dangerous environment is one in which security is purchased at the cost of choice, and a fixed architecture leaves no possibility of acting differently. The original 8 mice did not choose the rules of Universe 25. They could only live inside them. We can still choose, reconsider, and change our own rules. At least that is what separates a society from an enclosure.